Hello and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of talking to composer, audiovisual artist, and music researcher Patrick Hartono. In his creative work, Patrick explores many avenues, including spatialization, audio synthesis, psychoacoustics, machine learning, and visual music. His works have been seen and heard all around the world, including venues like ICMC, IRCAM, and NIM, and has also received several accolades, including the ICMA Audience Award in 2017, the 2019 WOCMAT International Electroacoustic Music Young Composer Award, and the Prix SIM residency in 2021 for his piece Parakletos. So Patrick holds a PhD in interactive composition from the University of Melbourne and is currently a lecturer in computational arts at Goldsmiths in London. So today we shall be chatting with Patrick and learning more about his creative process. So Patrick, hello, and thank you so much for talking with me today.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
You're quite welcome. So perhaps to begin, you could explain how you got into the world of music and also what drove you to the interactive composition side of things as well.
Oh yeah, so as I mentioned before our pre-conversation, before it's recorded, uh, I started, of course, like most of the people from Indonesia, at least from a classical music background. So I studied classical music. I even was flutist and also saxophonist. So I played those instruments in the past. But then I trying to seek somewhere else. I mean, in terms of what is I can do more than just playing an instrument. That I ended up to start composing. But at the beginning, I think it was 2000 and so I started my 2004, 2005, because I did high school of music. So during those high school, it's all music, it's all classical music. It's like European conservatory here also have this kind of great, you can study music even since an early age. However, during that time, it's totally different than now, Jacob. So what happened at least 15 years, 20 years ago, all this new music, electronic music, experimental, seems something very alienated, let's say, something very alien from Indonesia perspective. So I was also one of the person who actually against it because I already have this dogma, this understanding of what is music. And his music should be like Beethoven, or like John Williams because of Star Wars and all this Hollywood movie, right? And then I went to UPH, University of Pelita Harapan. Now they have Department of Music, which they call Conservatory. During that time, I was studied with Otto Siddhartha. So Otto Siddhartha was the student of Ton de Leeuw from Amsterdam University, right? And also he did some courses at sonology as well as IRCAM. And he introduced us to soundscape. And that's actually the beginning of my interest into this field. And then I become very fanatic actually with this concept of sound. Then I told him I don't want to learn any other things because when he taught composition back at UPH Conservatory, I still need to learn other things. And then these other things basically just repetition of all the classical, let's say, knowledge that I studied before. I told him I just want to study about sound, more deeper about sound. And then Roderick de Man and other Dutch musicians, including Alan Corver, went to Indonesia. I assist them during the tour, and then they told me, why don't you go to study in Holland? And then I actually lied to my father. I sell my family car.
Okay.
Yeah, I sell my family car, and then I start, to get into visa application and everything. it went smooth. I even already landed in Den Haag for the interview, because in the past there were no Zoom. We need to go there for the interview, right? So I went there, I did the interview, and then I got accepted as sonology. But when I returned, and then my parents know about that. So indeed, at the beginning, it's quite a journey. And one thing very important that I would like to always tell this, it's not about I would like to discuss about the past, but this is something to acknowledge, especially for people from Southeast Asia, so we can push further about our artistic exploration. So just imagine, Jacob, 15 years from now, I mean, until now, there is still some rejection, but it's not like at least 15 years, 20 years from now, before now, you will get canceled if you do our music. University canceled you. I get canceled. That's why actually I go to sonology. So it was like I am not able to perform my music at the venue, or even if I just go when students just gather and they have a discussion. If I go there, people will leave because they're afraid if I began to introduce this new idea about music, which is not really new also, right? But I mean, yeah, so this cultural barrier was very crazy there. Indeed, at the moment, it's still happening. When I talk with some of friends, a few days ago, I did also a live Instagram with community from there. But it's getting better, and in fact, experimental music in terms of noise music, we are one of the most active in the region. From the group friends of mine called Jogja Noise Bombing, and people from all around the world actually went there to play. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about. And so do you think, yeah, it'll take another 15 years before that kind of barrier can be breached, or do you
I
think?
mean, there is always a situation with this experimental music, even in Europe, right, or even in States. We always very segmented, right? But what happened in Indonesia, if there is rejection here, let's say in Europe, based on my experience living here almost 20 years also, and also in Australia, there is still kind of like hub or community where you can be facilitate, right? In Indonesia, no. It's really kind of like I don't know how you call it in a more arts context, but it's really about you need to face this conventional thought of people about music. Then it's become kind of like religious, like, oh, this is not music, this is not music. You're just cancelled. Yeah. So if you say over the next 15 years, I don't see that, because at the moment, if you ask me, so in the past, Jacob, as I mentioned, we had one of the best contemporary composition studies before Thailand now. Now Thailand is the best in our region. Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, but number one in Southeast Asia is now Thailand. In the past, we were the first. We were actually the first Southeast Asian country who had a contemporary music festival. But now actually Thailand is number one. So what happened in Indonesia, it's always very related with the political situation and educational system. And indeed, if I can speak in this musical podcast, there is still some of this elite that likes us to do not get smarter. So we struggle in this, indeed, in this kind of like post-colonial problematic context. For example, if you ask me, I mean, when I was in Holland, there was one very interesting conversation between me and an old lady during the train, in the train. So the lady asked me, what am I doing? Then I told her I am study composition, contemporary. And she even asked me, like, what are you doing then? Are you doing some kind of atonal? And I was, atonal? Then I say, oh yeah, I'm doing some kind of like music and color. Oh, like scrubbing. So this knowledge actually become the main fundamental problem in Indonesia.
Mm.
Even our history subject become one of the most competent at the moment.
Mm. Yeah.
Anyway, we are a young country. Come on, man. We are We are very young. We just get independent 1945, and we just had our first Reformation. I mean, like our first real Reformation is 97, right?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, yeah, very complex
Oh,
situation,
very complex
like,
situation.
yeah, an institutional level and academic and various, and also in your work. I mean, I'd like to get back to that more towards the end, but there is an importance of things like traditional Indonesian instruments that you try to
Yes.
bridge gaps in that kind of way. And I'd love to get to talk about that in more detail as well.
Yes.
But first, perhaps just to sort of give an introduction to people to your creative approach and to your creative practice. It appears to me that you have so two major strands of work, which are going to be electroacoustic works and audiovisual works.
Yes.
So I wonder if to sort of introduce people into your creative approach, if you could discuss what these two forms are for you,
Yes.
perhaps their differences and what they afford you as an artist.
Yes. So I start with electroacoustic composition for sure. Sound is always, let's say, the main thing in my practice, right? Then there were a time I get dropped out actually from sonology. So indeed, I am not really like a technical computer musician person. I mean, I have the technicality, of course. Then I think all my technicality is adequate to manifest any artistic project that I wanted with any help from others. So I think that's the level of my technicality. But again, all the technicality I always let's say redefine from artistic context. You know, so I'm not really somehow a person that working with linear way on following all the procedures. So I'm more like I'm totally an artist. So I got dropped out from sonology, then I need to return to Indonesia. And this is actually the most interesting part. When I was in Indonesia, my ears were trained differently, right? Because I listen to not really classical music, but I listened also to a lot of traditional music because I was studied at Yogyakarta, and Yogyakarta is the center of art in Indonesia. But when I went to sonology, then suddenly I was surrounded by all these crazy things like wave field synthesis. Can you imagine someone who's from this, let's say, not really a rural area, but this level gap of intellectuality suddenly moved to Netherlands, and I'm surrounded by everything. I Within a week I need to learn KIMA, super collider, Lips in the past. We need to learn Lips still in the past, and we perform with the wave field synthesis. And in just a few months before I started to find quadraphonic is very hard. And suddenly, when I was in sonology, so many speakers in one room, right? That's actually influenced my hearing, my sensibility of hearing. So when I returned to Indonesia, I was actually very depressed during that time, thinking about what I would like to do. I went to something called Sekaten. Sekaten is a ceremony that happened annually during a specific ritual year based on the Javanese calendar. So I went to the palace of Yogyakarta. So in the front of the palace, because Yogyakarta is not a Muslim, province or city, but got influence from a Muslim culture. They have a mosque in the front of the palace, and at the front of the mosque there are two small lounge actually, where they place a gamelan. So they place one gamelan here, and they place one gamelan here. And before they start the pray, in Muslim they have 5 different pray, right? Before they start the pray, they will start playing the gamelan. So they will start playing the gamelan here, and then when they finish, they will start playing the gamelan here. But the unique thing is, these two lawns surrounded by a huge wall, totally huge wall. So when they start playing Javanese gamelan, not Balinese, because it's a two different organologically perspective also. When they start playing the gamelan, all the sound, of course, will fluctuate all around the wall and all around the space, right? Okay. But the unique thing is when I'm there, I am become a different person with different glasses on my ears. Because before, when I perceived that, I just perceived a sound as of gamelan, right? But when I'm there, I perceive that as the real sound specialization. And that's actually the beginning of my journey in, let's say, in 3D sound and sound specialization. And if you ask me, because I spent the last 15 years trying the proper way of how to specialize sound, different speaker configuration. And if you ask me, like, the closest image of this spatiality I can get, or I have experienced with the modern technology, it's the eco speaker. Oh, and the eco speaker, because eco speaker will never really give you a direct sound image, and that's actually what I experience, and this is actually the real sound specialization, because what you experience is this reflection of sound within surrounding your acoustic space, and the reflection actually what you perceive. Yeah, and then why I began then explore the visual realm at the beginning is because at Sonology during 2009, that was the early, let's say, processing open framework get more popularity. And at Sonology, we have this Sonology department and art science, right? Here, we're just focused on sound, all sound subject. And suddenly, our friends from art science, they explore both. They have this flexibility based on their subject to explore both. Then I begin to get interest into it. But then something very interesting, Jacob, when I after I finished this gamelan experience, I returned back to Holland, to Rotterdam Conservatory and also sonology to finish my undergraduate. I get into noise community. I get into really noise community, and that's actually somehow influenced my aesthetic. If you listen to my music with this aggressivity and etc. etc. It turned that when I play the sound, then I specialize the sound at this certain level of aggressivity, let's say, I have different perception. It's not synesthetic, of course, because synesthetic somehow may happen at the very certain moment and say repeated. No, it's only happen when I perform that music at this very level of aggressivity. Then I see it. When I have this kind of like experience, I also very surprised because first time I tried it was at Sonology also at our multi-channel room. I somehow see something like fluid-like shape that going around the space. It's a very crazy experience, and from there I began to explore the visual. My first piece actually matrix studies. Not really my first piece. I always created many small etude. I always make a lot of pieces, but at the end of the day, something that I feel more like the culmination of everything, I called my piece. So metric study is actually one of the first outcome of my experiments. And that time, I'm really obsessed with the idea of psychedelic visual and how these two realms folded each other. So I begin to explore the idea of Michael Ciung. I'm not French, but I pronounce it right. Michael Ciung, about this added value, and also my friend, my mentor, Marco Ciciliani, who helped me a lot with the idea of Mickey Mousing, from the history of visual music, of course. But then the unique thing is I explore also the psychedelic aspect. I was intoxicated my body for over a month with mushroom until I eventually reached certain intoxicated level where I see this space is folded each other, and that's actually the idea visual from my matrix studies music.
Mm.
Yeah,
That's really fascinating to hear about. Yeah, so the sound being at the center of this creative approach and these different modalities of hearing and of listening and of perceiving sounds, be it cochlearly or visually, and how that has mutated across
yeah,
your various practices and stuff. And And yes,
Actually,
so
sorry, one thing that I need to re-emphasize, the first momentum when I began to somehow see is actually when I listened to the gamelan again. That's actually the first momentum. I experience sound, but I follow it. Like the people, the player play the gamelan here, but when they hit, I don't see the object here. I see it when the sound goes. It's just a unique multimodal event or experience that I encountered during that time. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's really fascinating to hear about that, and you use an array of different types of sounds in your work. So you've
Yes.
used Indonesian musical instruments, you use computer generated sound, you've used field recordings. I'd love to get into some of the details of specific pieces in a moment, but perhaps to sort of round off this introduction, perhaps you could talk about how you curate sounds for a musical project and what kind of conceptual and technical strategies you put in place. How do you go about constituting and navigating a world of different sounds that will come together in a moment or a performance to create a cohesive piece?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question because honestly, only recently, 2000 and I started my PhD 2020, so a year before 2019, that was actually the year, and it was winter 2019. That was actually the moment I eventually found my sound. Basically, to answer your question, like how I created sound. So, you know, I started with a very technical, a formal study at phonology, and then I went back to composition. But even during my study at Codarts and sonology for my minor, I somehow still really, how do you say it, more technical oriented. I always thinking about how to design the max parts, how to design the sound synthesis, etc., etc. And until the moment when I returned to Indonesia, it was after my master, just a gap year before doing my PhD. I lost everything. My Genelec was broken. I only have one Genelec. Then my computer also is about to die. And I began to think like I have all this technicality. I have a lot of sound banks that I had previously, from sound that I did. I also have a lot of sound bank from my previous soundscape journey, because I also started from soundscape. And of course, the recording from Indonesian traditional sound instrument. Then I'm thinking like, how can I come out with something from this? Like because I always want to have this ideally standard on how we compose electroacoustic music. I have two Genelecs, I have a proper computer controller, the more proper setup. But during that time, no, I was a bit not in unlucky situation. Then I read the idea. I reread actually again. It's been several time I read this paper, but I read again the paper from Kokores, his idea about holophony sound texture. This holophony sound texture. Uh, I wouldn't go detail about that, but the idea of holophony sound sector is a situation when, let's say, there are four sounds occur at the same time. Each of them will leave their own functionality to be perceived as one, right? And suddenly it's clicked in my mind about the concept of melody in Japanese gamelan. Because in Japanese gamelan, basically the idea of timing and everything is totally different from Western music. For example, like in one sequence, let's say, of a melody, to end up, normally we have a very strong beat, right? Okay, tom, 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 tom. That's in the Western music, right? In gamelan, no, actually. In every sequence of melody, it's always ended up with the gong ageng. Gong, gong. Ageng actually means great. So that's actually the biggest gong in the ensemble. Okay. That means the great one. So it needs to be end with this great gong ageng. And then normally the player of the gong ageng, it's the eldest or the most experienced sometimes. Yeah. And then that's actually the most difficult gamelan player told me to play, because you need to be able to hit at the perfect momentum. So what happened then? Normally in a Western musical language, there is kind of like ritardando happen. So, for example, there is a sequence of pattern ta tung tang tung ta tung tang tung, and then after this long fermata, this guy with the gong ageng must find the perfect momentum to hit it. So basically, you straight, 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 you wait, hit, right? But what is very interesting actually during this momentum, there are many melodies happen. There are many patterns happen. And this pattern happen always interaction between them, right? So I was then thinking like, oh, how can I create a system where this sound happen based on the act of my body gesture, okay? And then then how the timbre between them should be related to each other. Okay, then I eventually came up into the idea of creating this a polyphonic sampling. But during that time, I decided not to do it in Max MSP. I decided to do it in Ableton even, in a very simple. So I just like prototype. I would like to make like a proof concept of my idea, right? So the way I then create the timbre is a bit unique. So let's say more metallic sound from gong, because it's something I always like. Then I have a sample from glitch. Then I have more synthetic sound. Then I can have different timbre. Okay, but the unique thing, let's say I have four group of it, which is one object. Yeah, I have four group of it, and then on top of this sampler or whatever synthesis technique happen, yeah, I have my specific, let's say, randomized function. It's not really randomized. Sometimes also chaotic function I implement. So let's say I have the four synthesis or sampling whatsoever technique I implemented. I have four different randomized algorithm here, and then this randomized algorithm here then will receive input from my controller. This was also very incidentally. So I connect my lemur, in the past we have this lemur. I connect my lemur, then I use the a polyphonic MIDI from the lemur to control this four track. Then for me, that was actually the changing of everything. That's the first time I eventually feels that I have this very personal relationship with the sound. Wherever I move my sound, it's always smooth, but it's not like in a simple way of mapping, like in a common motion to sound that's happening. Like I have this piece follow my gesture, etc. No, it's a very rich of timbre. Why? Because I have four different sound characteristic of timbre that all of them randomized with their own individual generator, but the functionality of all the system always based on my control. So that's actually how I then created my, let's say, approach or my system in composing sound. And actually even go further, I read another paper from Kokoras about the idea, how about if the music, how about the sound is actually the music? And from there, I go forward creating my system.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And yeah, that idea of finding your sound, because yeah, I mean, on a very personal level, I also have, quite advanced technical chops in terms of
Yeah,
what I can do with Maximus P and with various
yeah,
processing environments and all that kind of stuff. But I think for me personally, I still haven't had that kind of favored
yeah,
moment of where I feel that
yeah,
I've found that
Yeah.
sound and that approach to
Yeah.
sound that's very personal to me, and
Yes.
that would give strength to my
Yes.
pieces and stuff.
And you know what is very interesting is after all these years, all this technicality that I achieved, when I found my own sound, it's not really technical as I expected before. It's actually very simple, but we goes everywhere yet, like we go all around here to explore, and eventually we find out, oh, it's actually just here, you know.
Yeah.
It's very unique. But of course, with the FluCoMa and other research during PhD, I developed this the more further. Yeah, but in the end, when I found my sound, I'm very surprised. It's just very small things that I never thought before. But then, Jacob, one thing very important is during that time, I arrived into this decision that what I did before is not really composing. My first composition, even after all these 20 years, I say that the first piece, the piece that I composed 2019, which I get this award from Walkmat, that's actually my first music. Before, I call them it's not my music. It's like a journey to find my own sound. But my, I even tell to most of my friends, and they were kind of like shocked. And then because I told them, I just composed my music. I found my music. And they asked me like, what do you mean? No, no, no. What I did before, it's like all exercises. It's like the journey exercise to find my sound. But I first start composing music is in 2009, 2019,
Mm.
December 2000, November 2019.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'd love to get into some more detail about some of your pieces and some of your recent work. Yeah, to hear about how some of these pieces are working on a technical level, it'd be a great way
Yes.
for people to grasp your creative process, I think. The first piece I'd like to discuss is Omnipresent from 2023.
Yeah.
So there's a recording of it performed at the International New Music Festival concert, which I'll link to below, which I can imagine doesn't quite stand up to listening to the piece live, but even from the recording, it's really, really intriguing. So the piece uses a technique called polymorphism sound synthesis, or
Yeah.
PSS. So I wasn't aware of it before learning about your work. But yeah, I was wondering if you could explain that piece, what you were looking to achieve sonically, and how it
Yeah.
works under the hood.
So, I already explained about my concept of creating
Yeah.
this the system, right? But then I it brings memory when I was work with Kima. And of course, Kima, we know Kima, but it's not really popular because the price is very expensive, like very expensive, right? And you know that Kima, it's actually developed based upon this idea of polymorphism sound transformation. So Carla Scarletti actually even wrote a paper what that was published at Computer Music Conference in the year of 1993. And then the idea, just one moment, sorry, 1992. And then the paper was called Polymorphic Transformation in Kima. Yeah, so basically, it's let's say the way I then perceive that and contextualize in my work, it's really it's really like the idea of this object-oriented programming. Okay, so when I start to push further, more advanced my concept, I create a different sound object in Max MSP. Sorry, I create one sound object in Max MSP. Okay, but then this sound object comprise all the necessary technical thing that I need, not only the sound synthesis, but also the spatialization. Yeah. And this sound object, and as I explained before, let's say it has so this object has five different sound objects, right? And then this five different sounds object then has its individuality. Okay. And this individuality controlled directly from the input that I receive, which I mentioned to you before. I have five different layer on top, which is the randomizer or mapping things. Okay, and on top of there, it will goes from MPE controller because I use this old MPE, so I forget the name. It's no longer on the market. The old MPE controller.
I don't know the name of
Yeah,
it, but I think
I forget the name. And then based on my gestures is actually composed. And the unique then and relevant to the concept of this polymorphism, then I can reuse this in a different way as an object. And therefore, the relationship of this timbre between them, it's always relevant. Like this idea programming of polymorphism. So I create this object in C++, then I recall this object again from different controller. I recall then from different controller. I recall from different context. So this is actually the idea of polymorphism sound synthesis. But the unique thing with this concept is not only, as I mentioned before, about the sound synthesis, but also the specialization. The specialization on it. And I'm working now on a paper, and then in this paper I will discuss more about this specialization, which I call embedded specialization. Hopefully, I will finish before September because I will write for the organized sound, and then the idea of it is because I always want to specialize sound, but the idea is the trajectory movement should actually come from the characteristic of the sound itself. It's not me made it up, draw the trajectory or whatsoever. And then that's actually where FluCoMa at the beginning I use also on top of using FluCoMa as a control, as a generative mapping to control the synthesis technique. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So in the piece, sort of in the writings around the piece, you also talk about the idea of sound emerging as a result of the composer's practice.
Oh yeah.
So I found that really interesting. It's something that has perhaps been discussed in other forms in some of the recent episodes of the podcast, sort of working with a corpus of one's own materials, self-sampling, decomposing, reusing one's work, that kind of thing. Is that something that cuts into your practice? Or?
Not really, actually. So my approach of composing is very similar with the approach of Kokoras. For some reason, when I went to the residency there at North Texas, for some reason, we matched at this level of creativity. Then we were surprised with each other. Oh, so you use the same approach with me? Yeah, I use the same approach, blah, blah, blah. And so I am not, let's say I'm talking in the context of electroacoustic music, yeah? I am not composing like the majority of composer does. I have sound material. I create the sound material. I have the material. Then I begin to organize and compose in DAW. No, it's not really my approach, actually. I start composing the music when the moment I start composing the sound. So it's a one step further, because mostly people separate this. I separate this process between creating the material and then composing, right? Me, no. I start composing at the moment I begin to compose the sound. So the sound basically is the music. Yeah. And then practically how this achieved, it's actually through the system that I explained. This idea, perhaps very similar with the piece by Pierre Henry, the one with the door. I forget of variation for something. But Pierre Henry spent a lot of time actually to practice with the door, right? To find like the proper. So when he start to record, he knows actually which angle to get the sound of it, and he start to record. So what I do is actually very similar. I spend a lot of time, Jacob, to familiarize myself with the system. So for example, when I would like to compose a new piece, I have one piece that I would like to compose for our staff show here. At the moment, I began to select which different timbre for the system. And what I do then, I began to practice like the performer, practice the piece. I began to practice. You can say improvise. I began to practice until I grasp how far I can push the sound. Okay, and then once I I always say, like, once I have this relationship with the sound, then I record it. But once I record it, it's already achieved the level of culmination, let's say, when I know when to start and when to stop, because I already had the practice with the sound. Then I record, then I have this one idea of sound.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
sound really this driving factor in your piece.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So another piece that makes use of PSS is Ciung Wanara from 2023, which
Yeah.
is an audiovisual piece. And
Yeah.
you mentioned there in Omnipresent using some of the FluCoMa tools, and you also use them here. I'm assuming that was the regression MLP stuff, but I
Yeah,
may be
regression.
wrong.
I mostly use regression MLP for the generative mapping. So indeed, generative mapping. And I think a month ago, Nicola from Montreal, I guess, the Spadgri is from Montreal, right?
Oh,
You know,
possibly. Yeah.
this specialization tool. They just released a new tools called MapSpad that use FluCoMa. And
Right.
they
Okay.
use audio descriptor from FluCoMa, so all the analysis of audio, and then they train all this outcome from the audio descriptor of FluCoMa to determine the sound trajectory. I actually did the same thing in the past, but not at the advanced technicality level as them. So in FluCoMa, I use the MLP for the generative mapping, and I use also the audio descriptor to somehow create the sound trajectory. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear because I mean a few of the people that have been on the podcast have used MLP regression and this idea of training models
Mm.
with relatively small amounts of data, and it's something that
Mm.
I find really fascinating. This idea
Mm.
of the model, because it's a technology that it's not new. At
Yeah.
Goldsmiths, you'll of course know Rebecca Fee-Brink's
Rebecca was there. Yeah.
Hyphenated. Yeah. But in terms of it's still somewhat mysterious in terms of methodology and very open in terms of how it can be approached
Yeah.
artistically. So yeah, I'd really love to hear how you train a model and
Yeah.
and what the role this notion of model plays in your work.
Yeah. So let's first start with the idea of training, and we go to the context of how model actually relevant with the artistic approach of me. So when training the model, the Ciung Wanara, it's actually my final project, and then the idea of that final project is I would like to push forward further about understanding the relationship between sound and visual within the context of audiovisual composition. That is really driven from the idea of added value, but I'm trying to find something more culturally relevant with me. And after this all long exploration, I found something interesting in our shadow puppet performance. We call it wayang, shadow puppet performance. uh, then I went to Indonesia. I go detail on there and try to find something very interesting actually doing the shadow puppet. And the first thing that I find very interesting during this shadow puppet performance is something called sabetan technique. Sabetan technique is only a technique. It's not only a technique, Jacob, but it's also a means for the puppeteer to interpret the narrative idea of the story. So basically, sabetan technique is a technique to move the puppet. So I try to analyze the movement. I first use Ritmo video analysis. Yeah, Ritmo video analysis. Ritmo from Norway video analysis software. Then I built my own using media pipe within Touch Designer environment to track the skeleton from the shadow puppeteer, so I can get more detailed data on two-dimensional on how the puppeteer movement during the performance, right? It's very interesting. Then I was thinking, like, how can I build then a system that can somehow understand, transcribe in a more non-linear way the movement of the shadow based upon my performance, and then to control this polymorphism system. So I'm not trying to make like motion recognition, which is if I make one motion and it's a response of something. I don't want to do that because I would like to have, something very interesting with the neural network MLP is the relationship between the dimensionality of the model, right? For example, if I train within this square box dimensional, yeah, and then if I go into this point, you should do this. But if I go slightly different, yeah, the model actually have their own way to interpret it, right? So based upon this idea, I decided to create a coordinate location of one movement during the shadow puppet performance. So I'm not trying to make like a gestural recognition, not like that, but just one movement. Then based on that movement coordinate, then I place the order and training the model. And what is very interesting actually when I finish training this model Jacob, what I mentioned before, the relationship between these two-dimensional spaces of data, it's really, really enhance this timbral relationship between the sound. And that's actually very fascinating. And not only that, because I also train its coordinate. Let's say in shadow puppet performance, most of the gesture during the fighting. So I'm mostly working during the fighting scenes. It's always circular like this. But the circulars, of course, is different. Sometimes like this, sometimes go down, or just go straight like this, right? But then let's say I go circular up like this, then I have several coordinate points, right? Then I say like, okay, this one is correspond to the specific data there, blah, 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 blah. But it also correspond to the spatialization. Yeah, and that's actually become very interesting. Why? Because at the end of the day, I find there is a unique relationship between me and the system. I mentioned before, I spend a lot of time actually exercise myself with the system. The more I exercise, the more I understand, and the more actually I can explore this timbre relation and the spatial relation simultaneously. But also based on this narrative story that I would like to tell to the audience. Because basically I'm trying to tell the story about this rooster fighting, right? So how then this telling story about this rooster fighting contributed to timbral and spatial composition? That's actually the fascinating part during the process.
Yeah. Well, it's such a powerful tool that seems to be, I mean, yeah, that I haven't seen massively used, but yeah, the use cases that I've seen of it are really, really interesting. It sounds really intriguing what you're doing with it. Sam Pluter as well, who worked as an artist on the FluCoMa project, has used it as well. It's really, for me, I mean, I remember when Rebecca came to Huddersfield to show Wekinator for the first time, I discovered that. It was just like this mind-opening moment, this like really, really exciting thing. Well, it's one of the most exciting things for me, I think, in the space at the moment, the kind of approaches that it's opening up for and allowing.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. One thing that I often talk with guests about is instrument design, which covers two important vectors, which are so mapping, which we've talked to about a bit in terms of the MLP and things like that, and also interface. I'd be interested to hear you talk about it. In the case of an interactive gestural audiovisual composition, how do you see your works existing on this spectrum between composition and instrument? When you perform the piece, what aspects are you engaging with as a performer? And for you, where does the border lie between instrument and prescriptive interactive system? Is there line to be drawn at all. Yeah, I'd be I'd be interested to hear how you approach that question.
Yeah, that's actually something that I've been honestly struggle lately. After I finish my PhD project, then how can I continue research on this field? And of course, the first idea that came out in my brain is about uh, to pursue further in terms of instrument design or interface design, so it can be, let's say, used by others too. And then for me, for me, I don't really see that the system I created, let's say for this Ciung Wanara, as a tools, because when I create the system, the idea actually inspired by the sabotan technique. So sabotan technique, from this cultural perspective, of course, the puppeteer don't see it as a technique also, but the puppeteer also see the technique as a representation artistic of him to interpret the narrative idea. So I'm somehow seeing from more holistic perspective. So I don't, indeed there is at a certain level we can determine that the system I created is an instrument, and then instrument, there is a relationship between me and the instrument in terms of human computer interaction. But I see the interaction between me and the system and the music as one holistic thing. That's actually my approach so far. Hopefully it's answered. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. And so hearing you talk about your different pieces and approaches to your creative work, so you've been talking about spatialization a lot.
Yes.
Um, but one thing that I find interesting in so spatialization is like a really important vector in like for the past half a century or so. It's a parameter that's been a fairly new parameter that's that composers and performers have really sort of been able to take under their wings and exploit and things like that. But a question that I find interesting that's brought up by that is so we've been talking about the sort of internal spatial
Yeah.
properties of sounds and things like that, and spatialization within the internal logics of a piece. But there's also so these pieces that you're playing are being played in physical spaces, and perhaps the same piece can be played in different spaces.
Different spaces.
And
Yeah.
and yeah, I wonder if you could talk about how you see your pieces with the spatialization element of them being so important, how they live in different pieces in different spaces, and how a piece that you've written can live within a specific site.
Yeah. My first question that relevant with what you asked actually during my class, shit, I forget the name of the class. I was about to tell you. But I remember the professor. It was Rafif at sonology, and then Rafif asked this nice question every time, because I took this class 3 times, Jacob. I didn't pass 2 times because I just want to came, but the last one I passed. And then the idea, oh, sound and space. That's actually the course name. And then he always asks about this question: which one first, sound or space? He always asks this question all the time, like which one first, sound or space, sound or space. Uh, I have a lot of reflection, both technical and conceptual, in this discourse, but for some reason, maybe because my first real spatial experience was with gamelan, I am really, really founded upon the idea of melody or music from gamelan perspective. Because in gamelan, it's a totally different understanding of musical system than in our Western. Different space, different momentum, different time, the music will always different. Indeed, they have score, but they call it skeleton melody. They have score, but they call it skeleton melody. but different space also will create totally different sonic experience. And I asked gamelan player during my research, Jacob, and I have also one friend here, Dr. Aris Daryono. I mean, like gamelan player with the PhD like us, but he's actually come from traditional background. And I asked him, and he mentioned that yes, the gamelan player perceive actually the specialization, and they are aware that this specialization that occurred in gamelan, it's due to this tuning system that collide, this frequency spectra that collide. So they have this awareness, and they also have awareness that different spaces is always create a different. It's the space somehow also decompose the music. So in the past, I was a very, very narrow guy that always want to have my piece based on my planning. For example, if I need to perform my piece with more sound projection system, not like a cosmonium, like if I need to go to Beast or I was perform at the Manchester, it's more like a sound projection, not like fixed ambisonic things. Uh, in the past, I always want to have a specific configuration. Okay, but then when I reflect upon this idea of space, sound, and melody in gamelan, I become somehow able to comprehend this idea of sound just born for free. I help it to born, but then when I execute different spaces, it's somehow also decompose my music. And that's actually the beauty of it. But indeed, in a more practical level, to achieve this conceptual idea, I always compose with higher ambisonic, either higher ambisonic or VBAP, or sometimes I combine both of them because VBAP somehow give you more direct, and ambisonic, it's more like AC direct, but somehow it's not like AC direct as other specialization. And also to achieve this, I somehow also try to grab some idea about spatial synthesis from Natasha Barrett. So I have a configuration of, let's say, ambisonic, and then in a specific ring, it's just a direct sound specialization to create all this dimensionality of spatial. But then, when the eco speaker came, it's different. It's different. Why? Because it's an object, Jacob. The speaker itself is an object. So I will even hypothesize that it's a spatial object. It's a very much a linear or relevant with my concept of one specialization and synthesis with my polymorphism, because I create one object where there is a sound synthesized happening there, controlled by me, but the specialization is come from within the internal, you mentioned internal data from the sound object itself. And it doesn't give you a direct something very interesting with that, actually, because it doesn't really give you a direct direction of sound, but instead of the illusion of it. And that's actually something very amazing.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating. That's great. I mean, just keeping an eye on the time, I'd probably move on to a few broader questions. One thing that I'd like to hear more about you talk is, so you talked about, so obviously you've been talking about how important sound is in your practice, and one specific type of sound that really engendered this sort of visual approach in your work, which is noise.
Yes.
So obviously noise is a vast subject, and probably one that needs much more contextualization than we can give it in the time we have.
Broad things.
Yeah. But so, yeah, I mean, you've written on this subject, and I'll be linking to those writings on the FluCoMa Learn platform. But so, yeah, I love noise. I love noisy music. I love harsh sounds and disordered sounds, and I have an idea, perhaps an instinctive idea of what noise is for me on an aesthetic level, be it in its acoustic or organizational dimensions. But yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about what noise is to you, and the roles that it can play in your work.
Yeah, it's a very interesting actually you asked this. So in the past, indeed, I do this harsh noise and all this kind of interesting realm of experimental music. But then understand it now in a more conceptual, let's say, understanding of a noise music. I still consider my music as a noise music because I I always consider noise as a something that neglected in a way, but has its own unique aesthetic. It's something like this idea of in intentionally deafness or in intentionally blind. If I walk through my office every day here, if I don't really pay attention, perhaps on the left side of me there is a sign that I cannot cross the street. But because my focus is always forward, I never see on the left side. And one time I eventually get fined by the police, which has never happened in the UK. But let's say I get fined by the police, and the police told me, you never see the sign that you cannot cross the street. So this idea of this intentionally deafness actually very important and relevant with my idea of noise. But something I would like to say honestly, uh, something that I artistically still not struggle but questioning a lot. Once I found my sound, then my music sounds almost the same, characteristically, aesthetically. And that's actually rose a lot of question. You understand what I mean, right? Yeah,
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 yeah.
yes. I found my sound. I feel comfortable with this type of timbre. I have my system, but then it's become a very big question for me. Am I stuck, or is it the culmination that we're talking about? Originality whatsoever, or am I stuck in this level?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, because that was in 2019 that
yeah.
you reached that point, and sort of going forward, how do you see yourself questioning that kind of situation? Is it technology that's good, advances in technology? Is it
I mean,
looking?
let's say, lately I'm began to interest with this quantum computer music, right? But then, even though I use this quantum computer music, then let's say the type of synthesis I use still similar with the timbre I wanted, it will be sound the same, right? It's a similar idea about like, shall I use machine learning or not using machine learning? Because in some way there is a task that we can still achieve without machine learning. And I always arose this question to my students, okay, you want to all use machine learning, but why? Tell me why. And honestly, I'm not gonna lie, I'm still struggle at the moment. But something that I can tell also in relevant with all this context and also relevant with your field, honestly, Jacob, I become more theoretical lately. So I'm a practice-based guy, okay? I'm a practice-based research guy, okay? But lately, the way I conceive all this new technology, I somehow become like artistic practice person.
Mm,
I began to dive into more let's say critical thinking and theoretical idea and approach analyzing people work. I have no idea yet. I'm actually scared also. But you get what I mean, right? Why I'm scared? Because in the past I was in this community like, I don't want to become more theorist. I want to become more artist. But somehow I reached this point, then naturally I am start embracing this because I realized that it's not only about me and my computer. There's other things also to discuss, which is society and then how actually people use this technology. That's become very fascinated.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, it will make for exciting listening anyway for the pieces that has come, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that progresses.
Yeah.
Um, perhaps to finish, to sort of bring things back to what we were discussing at the beginning. So yeah, talking about the different sounds that you're working with and the traditional Indonesian musical instruments that play a role
Yeah.
in your work. So yeah, I'm really fascinated by the idea of blending those kinds of sounds with things like computer generated sounds. And and on a general level, I'd love to hear how things like machine listening or music technology may have allowed you to explore, to navigate, and to engage with this sort of conceptual and physical corpus, which is that of traditional Indonesian instruments, which brings up a whole host of notions. So things like transporting these sounds into the digital domain, renewing the musical context within which these sounds are found, the question of relationship between sound and the instrument as a sonorous and cultural body. So yeah, if maybe to finish, if we could
Yeah.
discuss that and how
Yes.
that corpus plays a role in your work and how
Yes.
music technology may have allowed you
Yes.
to engage with it.
The biggest struggle for us, I mean, I cannot really say like us, but I mean from friends of me and me myself as Indonesian, when we would like to integrate our cultural into our practice, is how to not only use the exotism part of it. Okay, that's actually become the struggle. Then I'm still trying and always questioning on every step of me when I began to use all this sound from my culture. Then my answer to it lately, Jacob, I am not really. I mean, on the last few piece, I'm trying to get rid of it in terms of materialism. So I just don't want to have this materialistic, then try to put this into different contexts of music technology in a way, or use a specific method to somehow, let's say, enhance or detach the sonorous from the specific instrument. But what I what I do lately, it's more about the conceptual idea of the sound. For example, like the gamelan, as I mentioned to you, the gamelan sound, when you start playing the gamelan, sounds created, spatialization also created. It's a one holistic approach. So indeed, I'm not yet perhaps into the machine listening on all this relevant technology, because I found it's not yet something that I find relevant with my approach. Because at the end of the day, especially I can talk, my latest longest research was my PhD. I eventually arrived into this idea, like how then I understand conceptually about my music in a more profound abstraction even. Then how then, based on this conceptual idea, theoretical idea, philosophical idea of my own sound culture, I then create my own music, which indeed in this practice, I use in a more, let's say, Western modern technology. So that's actually my approach. Then I always telling this to most of my friends from Southeast Asia. Even our biggest homework is to not just showing our exotism. I mean, it's always a very thesis antithesis. People from West, we see orchestra, like very exotic, also very interesting. Also, people from here seeing a gamelan, very exotic. So there's always these intertwined things. But for me, then I'm more interested now to delve deeper in the more philosophical idea of the sound itself, and from all this philosophical idea, theoretical idea, and abstraction from my understanding of my own sound, I then establish this technology. Yeah.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much. That was
Thank
really,
you so
really
much.
interesting. It's Really good episode to finish this current
Yeah,
batch of FluCoMa podcasts on. It was really, really
yeah.
fascinating. Thank you so much.
My interview is sometimes chaotic, because I always jump all around, but hopefully it's okay.
No, we like chaotic and we like things that jump around here. No, it's really, really great. So just to remind the people that are listening, so this podcast is on YouTube and on the various audio platforms that the podcast comes out on. And if people are watching on YouTube, they should be able to find a link in the description to a page on the FluCoMa Learn platform, where they will be able to find links to everything that Patrick and I have been discussing today. So, Patrick, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacob.
It was a real pleasure. I shall
Real
speak to you
pleasure,
again
man.
soon.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Bye.